Dr. Ethan Cole had been on Noctera for exactly 3 weeks, and in that time he'd learned several important lessons about surviving among the Sangurics. First, never make direct eye contact unless invited. It was interpreted as challenge. Second, always carry the neutralizing compound that masked human blood scent, because even with diplomatic immunity, smelling appetizing was bad survival strategy. Third, when assigned Commander Saris Valen as your personal escort, you did exactly what she said when she said it, without question or hesitation. That last lesson was proving the hardest to follow, not because Ethan was rebellious, but because Commander Valen moved through the dark citadel with fluid grace that made her constantly disappear from view, and then she'd turn around with barely concealed contempt when he inevitably failed to keep up. "You are slow, Dr. Cole," she'd said on their first day together, her accent giving the words a musical quality that almost disguised the insult. "How does your species manage to colonize anything when you move like wounded prey?" Ethan, who'd been jogging to keep pace and was already winded, had managed. "We're persistent. Evolution favored endurance over speed." Evolution made poor choice. That had been 3 weeks ago. Their relationship hadn't improved. Commander Saris Valen was, by all accounts, one of the most dangerous beings in the Sangurix Empire. She served as Queen Valeria's personal bodyguard, a position that meant she'd survived centuries of combat, proved herself absolutely loyal, and possessed skills that made her feared across multiple systems. She was tall even by Sangurix standards, easily 6.5 feet, with the characteristic pale skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, eyes that shifted from silver to crimson depending on her mood, and features that were simultaneously beautiful and predatory in ways that made human aesthetic sense break down completely. She wore formal military attire that managed to be both elegant and threatening, and she moved with the kind of controlled power that suggested she could kill you 17 different ways before you finished blinking. Also, she clearly viewed Ethan as an irritating obligation, the human researcher assigned to her protection detail, because someone in the diplomatic corps thought it would be good to pair the visiting xenobiologist with the Queen's bodyguard for cultural exchange and mutual understanding. So far, the cultural exchange consisted mainly of Saris pointing out all the ways Ethan was inadequate for Sangurix society, and Ethan trying not to die of embarrassment or actual physical danger. Tonight was particularly problematic because they were attending the eclipse ritual, one of the most sacred ceremonies in Sangurix culture, where the entire court gathered in the Grand Hall during the planetary eclipse to honor their connection to darkness and blood. Ethan had been granted permission to observe as part of his research, but he'd been given extensive instructions. Stay silent, stay still, stay in the designated observer area, and absolutely do not interrupt the ceremony or touch anyone without explicit permission. He'd memorized all the rules. He'd prepared extensively. He was determined not to cause an interstellar incident through ignorance or clumsiness. The Grand Hall was massive, cathedral-like space with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into darkness above, walls covered in bioluminescent organisms that provided the only light in shifting patterns of blue and purple, and gathered Sangurix nobility standing in precise formations that probably had cultural significance Ethan hadn't learned yet. He stood in his designated observer area near the back, trying to be invisible while simultaneously taking mental notes on the ceremony for his research. The ritual itself was fascinating, coordinated movement that was part dance and part martial demonstration, accompanied by harmonics that Sangurix could produce in their throats that human vocal cords couldn't replicate. Ethan watched, mesmerized despite his nervousness, and tried to commit everything to memory. That's when someone behind him, another observer, apparently not watching where they were going, shoved past roughly, pushing Ethan forward off balance. He stumbled, trying to catch himself, and crashed directly into the Sangurix standing in front of him. Specifically, he crashed into Commander Saris Valen, who'd been standing at attention as part of the Queen's honor guard. More specifically, his momentum carried him forward such that his hands made very brief, very unfortunate contact with her backside before he managed to catch himself and stagger backwards. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The ceremonial harmonics cut off mid-phrase. Every Sangurix in the hall turned to look. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that felt physical, pressing down with weight of hundreds of predators, all simultaneously noticing prey that had just done something profoundly stupid. Commander Saris Valen turned slowly. And when Ethan said slowly, he meant with deliberate, controlled movement that somehow conveyed more threat than any sudden motion could have. Her eyes had shifted to deep crimson, the color that every briefing had warned meant danger, aggression, or bloodlust. Her lips pulled back slightly, revealing the fangs that Sangurix usually kept concealed in polite company. And her voice, when she spoke, had dropped to something that wasn't quite a growl but was absolutely lethal in tone. "Do you want to die, human?" Ethan's mind was racing through all the possible responses, and finding none of them adequate. Apologize, that implied he'd done it deliberately, which was worse. Explain it was accident, that sounded like excuse. Stay silent, that might be interpreted as defiant or disrespectful. He opened his mouth, not certain what would come out, already calculating how quickly he could die and whether it would be painless. But then something strange happened. Commander Valen froze mid-threat. Her expression shifted from rage to confusion, her eyes widening in what looked remarkably like shock. The crimson faded from her eyes, replaced by silver that was somehow more intense than usual. And she was staring at him like he'd just done something impossible rather than just profoundly disrespectful. Around them, other Sangurix were reacting. Whispers spread through the hall, actual whispers, which was unusual because Sangurix could communicate subvocally in ways humans couldn't quite hear. But these were audible, urgent, shocked whispers that Ethan couldn't understand, but that clearly meant something significant had happened. One word kept being repeated: resonance. Ethan had no idea what that meant, but from the way Commander Valen was staring at him, and the way every other Sangurix in the hall had gone from hostile to stunned, it was clearly important. "Commander," the Queen's voice cut through the whispers. Queen Valeria herself had turned from her central position to observe, and her tone carried curiosity rather than anger. "Is it true?" Saris didn't answer immediately. She was still staring at Ethan, her expression cycling through emotions he couldn't identify. Finally she spoke, and her voice was carefully controlled in ways that suggested she was fighting for that control. "Yes, my queen, it is. It is resonance. I don't understand how, but it is undeniable." More whispers, louder now. Someone said something that sounded like impossible in the Sangurix dialect Ethan had been learning. "Remove him from the hall," Queen Valeria commanded. "You and the human to your quarters. We will address this after the ritual concludes. No one is to interfere or approach them. That is royal decree." Saris bowed, sharp, military gesture, and then her hand was on Ethan's arm, grip strong enough to make it clear he had no choice but to follow. She pulled him toward the hall's exit with movements that were controlled but faster than her usual pace. The crowd of Sangurix parted before them, staring with expressions ranging from shock to fascination to something that might have been fear. Ethan stumbled along beside her, his mind racing. What was resonance? Why had accidentally bumping into her, accidentally groping her, his mortified brain supplied, why had that caused this reaction? And why was he being taken to her quarters rather than to whatever passed for Sangurix detention or execution chambers? They moved through corridors in silence, Saris's grip never loosening, her pace never slowing. Other Sangurix they passed stopped and stared, whispered to each other. Word was apparently spreading fast. Finally, they reached a section of the citadel that Ethan recognized as officer quarters. Saris dragged him through a door into what was clearly her personal space, larger than Ethan's guest quarters, decorated with weapons and military honors, but also with comfortable furniture and personal items that made it clear this was where she actually lived. She released his arm and moved to the far side of the room, putting distance between them. Then she stood there, her back to him, her shoulders tense with what? Anger, confusion. Ethan couldn't tell. Commander Valen. Ethan ventured carefully. I'm sorry, it was an accident. Someone pushed me and I lost my balance. I didn't mean to. Stop talking. Her voice was controlled but strained. I need to think, I need to. She trailed off, one hand coming up to her forehead in gesture that looked almost human in its indication of stress. Ethan waited, standing awkwardly near the door, not daring to move closer but also not certain if he was allowed to leave. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only a minute or two. Finally, Saris turned to face him. Her eyes were silver again, but they were watching him with intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. Dr. Cole, I am going to explain something to you and you will listen carefully. What just occurred in the Grand Hall should not be possible. It is, according to all Sanguric science and history, completely impossible. Yet it happened. Which means we are both now facing situation with no precedent and no clear protocol. I don't understand, Ethan said. What happened? Everyone kept saying resonance. What does that mean? Saris moved to a chair and sat precise, controlled movement, and gestured for Ethan to sit as well. He did, perching on the edge of a chair across from her, still tense and confused. Resonance, Saris began, choosing her words carefully, is a biological phenomenon that occurs between compatible Sangurics. It is mate bond signal, manifesting as immediate, undeniable physical and chemical recognition. When resonance occurs, both parties experience it simultaneously. The scent changes, becoming uniquely identifiable. The body responds in ways that cannot be controlled or faked. It is sacred in our culture, the foundation for permanent bonding and partnership. Ethan's stomach dropped. Wait, you're saying that when I accidentally bumped into you, you triggered resonance, Saris interrupted. I experienced the full manifestation of the mate bond signal in response to your touch, which should be impossible, Dr. Cole. Resonance occurs only between compatible Sangurics. There has never been a recorded instance of it occurring between Sangurics and another species. Ever. Our biologies are too different. The chemical signals that trigger resonance should not exist in human physiology. But they do. Ethan asked, his voice coming out higher than he would have liked. Or I do, or something. Apparently so, because every Sangurix in that hall perceived it. They smelled the change in my scent. They saw my physical reaction. And I. She paused, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely uncertain. I felt it, the recognition, the pull, the absolute certainty that you are compatible mate. Which is biologically absurd and socially catastrophic, but is nevertheless undeniable. Ethan sat in stunned silence trying to process this information. So what happens now? Is this bad? I mean, obviously it's unprecedented, but is it dangerous for me? For you? Saris's laugh was bitter. Dangerous is understatement, Dr. Cole. According to Sanguric's law and custom, when resonance occurs, there are only two acceptable outcomes. The individuals involved formally bond as mates, or one of them dies to release the other from the biological imperative. Dies? Ethan's voice cracked on the word. You're saying that because I accidentally triggered this resonance thing, one of us has to die. Not quite. The tradition exists because killing your potential mate is considered so horrific that it essentially never happens. The biological imperative to protect the one who triggered your resonance is extraordinarily strong. So the custom exists as formal acknowledgement that the only way to escape resonance is through death. But in practice, once resonance occurs, bonding inevitably follows. She looked at him directly. Except in this case, bonding a human is unthinkable for someone in my position. I am the Queen's personal bodyguard. I cannot bond with human researcher, especially not one whose presence in our empire is temporary diplomatic gesture. It would be political catastrophe and personal humiliation. Then what do we do? Ethan asked, fighting down panic. There has to be another option. That is what I am trying to determine. Sarah stood and began pacing. The Queen ordered us isolated until the ritual concluded. She will summon us afterward to discuss this situation. She is wise and has ruled for millennia. If there is precedent or solution, she will know it. Until then, we remain here and we do not touch each other again. The resonance is new, not yet fully established. Perhaps if we maintain distance, it will fade without completing the bond. Does that ever happen, the resonance fading? Ethan asked hopefully. No, Saris admitted. But there is no precedent for resonance between species. Perhaps the rules are different for us. Perhaps your human biology will allow you to ignore what my Sangurix biology cannot. She turned to look at him and her expression was complicated. Frustration, confusion, and underneath it, something that looked like unwilling fascination. I do not want this, Dr. Cole. I did not choose you. You are human, fragile, short-lived, completely unsuitable as partner for Sangurix warrior. But my biology has recognized you as compatible mate, and that recognition is not something I can simply dismiss or ignore. Already I am experiencing protective instincts toward you that are inappropriate and inconvenient. Already your scent has become something I am acutely aware of in ways that should not matter. This is disaster, and I am attempting to determine if there is any solution that does not end in your death, my resignation, or our bonding. Ethan absorbed that. On one hand, it was flattering in the most bizarre way possible. He'd accidentally triggered a sacred mate bond with one of the most dangerous beings in the Sangurix Empire. On the other hand, she just listed several ways this could end in his death, and also made it very clear she found the entire situation horrifying. For what it's worth, he said carefully, I'm sorry. I didn't know this was even possible. I was just trying to stay out of the way during the ceremony. If I'd known that accidentally bumping into you would trigger this, I would have been a lot more careful. Your apology is noted and irrelevant, Sarah said, though her tone was marginally less hostile than usual. Intent does not matter to biology. The resonance has occurred. Now we must deal with consequences, regardless of how we feel about them. They sat in tense silence, waiting for the Queen's summons, both acutely aware of each other's presence in ways that neither wanted to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. Ethan had come to Noctera to study Sangurix biology and culture. He'd never imagined he'd become the first human in history to accidentally trigger a sacred mate bond with one of their most elite warriors. And he definitely hadn't imagined that his life would depend on figuring out how to navigate biological imperatives, political complications, and the increasingly complicated feelings of a deadly alien vampire woman who'd gone from wanting to kill him to being biologically compelled to protect him. This, he thought, was not covered in any of the xenobiology training courses he'd taken. The Queen's summons came 2 hours after the disastrous eclipse ceremony. 2 hours of increasingly uncomfortable silence in Commander Valen's quarters, during which Ethan tried to make himself as small and inoffensive as possible, while Saris paced, radiating controlled tension that would have been terrifying if it hadn't been so clearly directed inward rather than at him. When the communication console chimed, Saris answered with military precision. Commander Valen, I acknowledge the summons. We will attend immediately. Ethan asked nervously. Did you think the Queen would summon me alone to discuss the unprecedented situation involving the human researcher and the sacred resonance? Saris's tone was dry. You are central to this disaster, Dr. Cole. You will explain yourself to Queen Valeria directly. Explain what? That I'm clumsy and have terrible luck. Ethan stood, trying to gather what dignity he could. I don't think that's going to help. Then be silent and let me speak unless directly addressed, Saris commanded, already moving toward the door. And do not make eye contact with the queen unless she grants permission. Among Sangurik's royalty, that courtesy is even more critical. They moved through the citadel corridors with Saris setting a pace that Ethan had to jog to maintain. Other Sanguriks they passed stared with open fascination. Word had clearly spread. The Queen's bodyguard had experienced resonance with the human researcher. Based on the whispers and shocked expressions, this was the scandal of the decade, possibly the century. The throne room was smaller than Ethan had expected, though still impressive. Circular chamber with the bioluminescent organisms creating shifting patterns of light across walls. And at the center, a throne that looked like it had been carved from single piece of black stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Queen Valeria sat on that throne with the kind of absolute authority that came from millennia of unquestioned rule. She was taller than Saris, easily 7 feet, with the same pale skin and predatory beauty, but amplified in ways that made it clear this was someone whose power went beyond physical capability into actual political and social force. Her eyes were deep gold, different from the silver or crimson Ethan had seen in other Sanguriks, and they tracked his movement with attention that made him feel like an insect being studied by entomologists. Several other Sanguriks were present, advisors, probably, based on their formal attire, and the way they stood in positions of obvious importance. All of them were watching Ethan and Saris, with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Saris dropped to one knee in formal bow. Ethan, following her earlier instructions, mimicked the gesture though he was certain his form was awkward. "Rise!" Queen Valeria's voice carried easily through the chamber despite being barely above conversational volume. "Commander Valen, Dr. Cole, we will discuss the situation that has disrupted the most sacred ceremony of our people. First, I wish to hear from you directly, Commander. Is the resonance genuine?" Sarah stood, her military bearing perfect but her voice carrying strain that Ethan could hear even if others might miss it. "Yes, my queen, it is undeniable. The scent change was immediate and unmistakable. The physical response was beyond my control. Every indication confirms genuine resonance despite the impossibility of such occurring with human." "And you, Dr. Cole?" The Queen's attention shifted to Ethan, and he fought the urge to flee from the intensity of her focus. "You triggered this resonance through accidental contact during the eclipse ceremony. Explain how this occurred." Ethan kept his eyes down, addressing the floor rather than the Queen directly. "Your Majesty, I was in the designated observer area. Someone behind me, I don't know who, shoved past roughly and pushed me forward. I lost my balance and collided with Commander Valen. It was purely accidental. I would never intentionally disrespect the ceremony or touch anyone without permission. I apologize for the disruption." "Your apology is noted," the Queen said, and her tone was thoughtful rather than angry. "However, it is not your fault that matters here. The question we must address is what happens now. An unprecedented situation requires unprecedented solution." One of the advisors, male, with scars across his face that suggested extensive combat history, spoke up. "My queen, with respect, there is only one solution. The human must be removed from Noctera immediately. This aberration cannot be allowed to disrupt the natural order of our society. Resonance is sacred. It cannot possibly be genuine between our kind and his." "And yet it occurred," another advisor countered, female, with scholarly bearing that suggested academic rather than military background. "Which means our understanding of resonance may be incomplete. This is unprecedented opportunity to study the phenomenon. We should be examining why and how this human-triggered response we believed impossible rather than dismissing it out of fear." "Fear?" the scarred advisor bristled. "I do not fear the human. I am concerned about the implications. If resonance can occur between Sanguriks and humans, it undermines millennia of our understanding about compatibility, about the sacred nature of the bond, about—" "Enough!" Queen Valeria's voice cut through the brewing argument. "I did not summon you to debate implications. I summoned you to determine appropriate course of action. Commander Valen, you have experienced resonance with the human. What is your assessment of the situation?" Saras's jaw tightened, and Ethan could see her fighting for composure. "My queen, I am conflicted. My training and my loyalty to you dictate that I should dismiss this as biological anomaly and request the human's immediate removal from my presence. However, the resonance is not anomaly. It is real, and it is already affecting my judgment. I am experiencing protective instincts toward Dr. Cole that are inappropriate for my position. I am aware of his presence constantly. I am compelled to ensure his safety in ways that override rational assessment. In other words," the Queen said quietly, "the bond is already forming despite your conscious resistance." "Yes, my Queen. And you, Dr. Cole," the Queen's attention returned to Ethan. "You are human. Your species does not experience resonance as we do. What are you feeling in response to this situation?" Ethan considered carefully. "Your Majesty, I don't experience whatever chemical or biological signals Commander Valen is experiencing. But I'm aware that I did something that has put her in an impossible position, and I'm concerned about her well-being despite knowing she could kill me without effort. I don't know if that's my response to the resonance or just basic human empathy, but I don't want this to destroy her career or cause her distress." Several advisors made sounds of surprise. The scholarly one looked intrigued. "He experiences concern for her well-being despite being in personal danger. That is consistent with early stages of bond formation, even if the mechanism is different." "This is absurd," the scarred advisor insisted. "We cannot seriously be considering allowing this to proceed. Commander Valen is the Queen's personal bodyguard. She cannot bond with a human who will be gone from our empire in months once his research term concludes. It would be degrading to her position and insulting to our traditions." "And what would you suggest?" the scholarly advisor challenged. "That we execute the human. That would violate the diplomatic agreements between our species and could trigger conflict. That we force Commander Valen to suppress the resonance. That is biologically possible but extraordinarily damaging, potentially leaving her impaired for decades. Or perhaps you suggest we exile Commander Valen for experiencing biological response she could not control." "I suggest," the scarred advisor said coldly, "that we acknowledge this as unfortunate accident and find solution that does not require us to legitimize impossible bond between our most elite warrior and fragile human, who should never have been near her during sacred ceremony." The debate continued, various advisors offering opinions that ranged from executing Ethan to studying them both as scientific curiosities to simply exiling both of them from Noctera and letting them figure it out elsewhere. Through it all, Sarah stood rigid at attention, and Ethan tried to make himself invisible while his fate was debated by beings who viewed him as everything from threat to inconvenience to interesting specimen. Finally, Queen Valeria raised one hand and silence fell immediately. "I have heard sufficient arguments. I will now make my decision and it will be final. No appeals, no debates, no challenges. Understood?" Every advisor bowed acknowledgement. Ethan and Saras did the same, though Ethan noticed Saras's hands were clenched at her sides. "The resonance is real," the Queen said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "I have lived long enough to know that biology does not lie, even when it confounds our expectations. Commander Valen has experienced genuine resonance with Dr. Cole. The fact that he is human does not invalidate the bond. It merely means our understanding of compatibility was more limited than we believed." She turned her golden gaze to Saras. "Commander, you have served me faithfully for 3 centuries. You have protected me, fought for me, demonstrated loyalty beyond question. I will not punish you for biological response you could not control. However, the resonance cannot be ignored or suppressed without causing you significant harm. Therefore, you are faced with choice. You may accept the bond and pursue formal union with Dr. Cole, which will require adjustments to your position, but will allow you to remain in my service. Or you may choose to sever the bond through separation, which will require you to leave my service and spend extended time away from Noctera while the resonance fades, if it fades at all. My queen, Ceres's voice was strained. I cannot abandon my position. My duty to you is. Your duty to me will be served regardless of which choice you make. The queen interrupted gently. If you choose the bond, you will continue as my bodyguard with your human mate accommodated within our society. If you choose separation, you will be released from service with honor, and when the resonance has been adequately managed, you may petition to return if you wish. Both paths serve me, one through your continued presence, one through your well-being. The question is which serves you. She turned to Ethan. Dr. Cole, you have less choice in this matter, as you did not experience the resonance directly. However, you will be affected regardless. If Commander Valen chooses to accept the bond, you will be expected to formalize union with her according to our customs, which will bind you to Noctera for extended period. If she chooses separation, you will be returned to human space within the week to prevent the resonance from completing despite her wishes. Do you understand the implications? Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. His entire future was being decided based on whether an alien vampire warrior he'd known for 3 weeks decided that accidentally triggering a biological mate bond was worth pursuing or worth running away from. I will give you until morning to decide, Queen Valeria announced. Commander Valen, return to your quarters with Dr. Cole. Discuss this between you. Determine if the bond is something you can accept or if separation is preferable. Tomorrow you will present your decision, and we will implement it accordingly. That is all. They were dismissed with formal gesture, and Ceres led Ethan out of the throne room in silence. They walked through corridors back to her quarters without speaking, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Once they were back in her private space, door sealed behind them, Ceres moved to the far side of the room and stood with her back to him, her shoulders tight with tension. Commander Valen, Ethan began. Ceres, she interrupted quietly. If we are to discuss bonding, you may use my name. Commander Valen is what my soldiers call me. Ceres is what a mate would call me. Ceres, Ethan tried, and the name felt strange on his tongue. I don't want to ruin your life. If bonding with me means destroying your career or causing you unhappiness, then we should choose separation. I'll go back to human space, you'll stay here, and eventually the resonance will fade. It won't fade, Ceres said, finally turning to face him. That is pleasant fiction. The Queen offered to give me excuse to choose separation without admitting weakness. Resonance does not fade. It will remain unfulfilled for decades, possibly for the rest of my life. Every compatible mate I encounter will feel wrong. Every partnership I might pursue will be compared to the one I rejected. I will spend centuries knowing I refused the sacred bond, and that knowledge will diminish me. Then what do you want to do? Ethan asked. Really want, not what duty or tradition says you should want. Ceres was silent for a long moment, her silver eyes studying him with intensity that made him uncomfortable. I do not know you, Dr. Cole. I have been your escort for 3 weeks, during which time I have treated you with contempt for your human weakness and incompetence. I have made it clear I view you as burden, as responsibility I did not choose and do not enjoy. And now my biology insists you are the one being in the universe I am meant to bond with. It is absurd. It is humiliating. And it is undeniable. She moved closer, and Ethan noticed for the first time that her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the effort of restraint. I want to reject this. I want to maintain my position, my reputation, my life as it was. But every moment I am near you, the pull becomes stronger. Already I am noticing details I should not care about, the way you move, the sound of your voice, the scent that my biology has marked as mine. And already I am fighting urges to protect you, to ensure your safety, to keep you close. This is not rational. This is not what I want. But it is what I am experiencing, and it will not stop. So what do we do? Ethan asked, his voice barely above whisper. We spend the night attempting to determine if the human who triggered my resonance is someone I can actually tolerate bonding with for the rest of your life, Sarah said bluntly. Because that is what formal union means. You will live perhaps another 70 years if you are fortunate. I will live for centuries beyond that. But for those 70 years, you will be mine, and I will be yours, and we will have to find a way to make that arrangement tolerable. 70 years is a long time to spend with someone who views you as burden, Ethan pointed out. Yes, Saris agreed. Which is why we will spend tonight talking. We will learn about each other. We will determine if there is any foundation for partnership beyond biology. And tomorrow, I will make decision. Either accept bond and attempt to build something real with you, or reject it and spend the rest of my very long life managing the consequences of that rejection. She gestured to seating area. Sit, Dr. Cole. Tell me about yourself. Not your research, not your diplomatic mission, but you. If I am to consider bonding with you, I should at least know who you are beyond clumsy human who disrupted my life. Ethan sat, and Sarah settled across from him, her posture slightly less rigid than before. And for the rest of the night, they talked, genuinely talked, without the contempt that had colored their previous interactions, without the military formality that had kept them distant. Ethan learned that Saris had served the Queen for 3 centuries, but had lived 2 centuries before that in military service to previous monarch. She'd chosen warrior path early, preferring combat to court politics, and had risen through ranks through competence and absolute loyalty. She'd never experienced resonance before, had watched other Sangurics bond, and wondered if her biology was simply incompatible with everyone she'd encountered. She'd made peace with possibility of remaining unbonded, focusing on duty instead of partnership. Saris learned that Ethan had pursued xenobiology because he was fascinated by how life adapted to different environments, that his family thought he was insane for accepting research position on Vampire Homeworld, and that he'd spent his entire adult life studying species most humans considered too dangerous to approach. He'd never married, never even had serious relationship, because his work took him to frontier worlds and dangerous locations where partnerships didn't survive. They discovered they both valued competence over politeness, preferred direct communication over diplomatic dancing, and had similar dark sense of humor that humans and Sangurics apparently shared despite biological differences. As the night wore on, Saris's posture relaxed slightly, and Ethan found himself less terrified and more genuinely interested in the deadly warrior who was considering whether he was worth bonding with. "You are not what I expected," Saris admitted as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky visible through her windows. "I have spent 3 weeks viewing you as inadequate human who required my protection. But you are intelligent, adaptable, and you chose career studying beings most of your species fear. That requires courage I did not give you credit for." "You're not what I expected either," Ethan said honestly. "I thought you were just contemptuous warrior who hated being assigned to escort me. But you're dealing with impossible situation with remarkable strength. That's impressive." Saris was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dr. Cole, Ethan. I have made decision. I will accept the bond." Ethan's breath caught. "Are you sure?" "I am not sure of anything except that rejecting it will diminish me more than accepting it. And I find that I am curious about you. About whether the partnership my biology insists is possible could actually work. It will not be easy. There will be political complications, social challenges, and significant adjustments required. But I hope, it may be worthwhile." She stood, extending her hand in formal gesture. "Will you accept bonding with me, Ethan Cole? Will you agree to formal union according to Sanguric's custom, acknowledging that you will be bound to me and to Noctera for the rest of your natural life?" Ethan stood as well, taking her hand carefully. I accept, though I reserve the right to be terrified of you occasionally because you are genuinely scary. Sarah smiled, first genuine smile he'd seen from her. That is acceptable. I will attempt to be less contemptuous of your human weakness. We will learn together. And as dawn broke over Noctera, two beings from different species prepared to present their decision to the Queen and begin building something unprecedented. Partnership founded on accidental biology but maintained through genuine choice. It was insane. It was unprecedented. And for reasons neither of them fully understood yet, it felt right. The formal bonding ceremony was scheduled for 7 days after Ceres, and Ethan presented their decision to Queen Valeria. The Queen had accepted their choice with satisfaction that suggested she'd expected this outcome, had made arrangements before they'd even arrived, and was generally pleased with how the scandal had resolved into something potentially valuable. This bond, the Queen had told them, is unprecedented. It will establish foundation for deeper alliance between our species. The political implications are considerable. You will both serve as ambassadors for this new understanding, proof that Sangurics and humans are more compatible than anyone believed. That was great for interstellar relations. It was less great for Ethan and Ceres, who were suddenly thrust into public attention as the first interspecies bonded pair in Sangurics history, while they were still figuring out how to actually talk to each other without defaulting to their previous dynamic of contempt and apology. The 7 days before the ceremony were chaotic. Ethan had to learn Sangurics bonding traditions, which were complicated and involved blood rituals that made him deeply nervous. Ceres had to arrange adjustments to her duties that would accommodate a human mate who couldn't accompany her everywhere she went, and definitely couldn't assist in actual combat situations. And both of them had to endure constant scrutiny from Sangurics nobility, diplomatic observers from multiple species, and media representatives who'd gotten word that history was being made on Noctera. They also had to actually spend time together, which was awkward in new ways now that they'd committed to bonding. We should establish boundaries, Ceres announced on the 3rd day of preparations, after they'd spent an uncomfortable hour sitting in her quarters not quite sure how to interact. Physical boundaries, social boundaries, expectations for the partnership. We are entering this bond without the traditional courtship period. We need clear communication to compensate. Agreed, Ethan said, relieved to have practical focus. So what are your boundaries? They spent the next several hours discussing everything from living arrangements to public behavior, to what each of them needed for personal space and autonomy. It was clinical, methodical, and absolutely necessary, because they were essentially entering arranged marriage without the time traditional Sangurics couples had to develop understanding naturally. Ethan learned that Ceres valued competence and directness above all else, that she needed several hours of solitude daily to manage the intensity of her duties, and that she expected complete honesty even when truth was uncomfortable. She was also terrified, though she'd never used that word, that bonding with a human would make her appear weak to other Sangurics warriors. I have spent 3 centuries building reputation as formidable warrior, she admitted. I have commanded soldiers, defended the Queen, earned respect through demonstrated capability. Now I am bonding with human researcher who many Sangurics view as fragile novelty. They will question whether I have gone soft, whether the resonance has weakened me, whether I am still capable of my duties. Have you gone soft? Ethan asked carefully. No, but I am different. The resonance has made me aware of vulnerabilities I did not acknowledge before. I am concerned about your safety in ways that could compromise my tactical judgment. I am noticing emotions I typically suppress. That is dangerous for someone in my position. Or it's healthy, Ethan suggested. Maybe caring about someone doesn't make you weaker. Maybe it just makes you more complete. Ceres gave him a look that suggested she thought he was being naive, but there was something almost fond in the expression. That is very human perspective. We will see if it translates to reality. Ethan learned that he'd need to be more careful about his tendency to wander off following research interests without informing anyone where he was going. That Sangurix society expected mates to present united front in public regardless of private disagreements, and that Saris expected him to continue his research rather than becoming defined solely as the commander's human mate. I did not trigger resonance with human who would be content to sit in my quarters and be decorative, she said bluntly. I bonded with xenobiologists who chose to study dangerous species. Continue that work. Maintain your competence. I have no interest in mate who makes themselves smaller to fit beside me. It was strange, building partnership in reverse, commitment first, understanding developing afterward. But they were both adaptable, both pragmatic, and both willing to put in effort required to make unprecedented situation work. The bonding ceremony itself was an elaborate affair combining Sangurix blood ritual with adaptations for Ethan's human biology. He had to drink small amount of Saris's blood, which his body would process differently than Sangurix processed it, but which would still create chemical bond recognizable to Sangurix as formal union. Saris had to accept his blood in return, which was symbolically important even though human blood didn't have the same biological significance to Sangurix that their blood had to each other. The ceremony was held in the grand hall where the disaster had begun, which felt deliberately symbolic. Queen Valeria presided, and the assembled court watched with expressions ranging from fascination to disapproval to genuine happiness. When it came time for the blood exchange, Ethan tried not to think too hard about the fact that he was drinking vampire blood and focused instead on Saris's steady presence beside him. She'd chosen to wear formal military attire modified for the ceremony rather than traditional bonding robes, which was apparently unconventional but very her, acknowledging the tradition while maintaining her identity as warrior. The blood tasted strange, metallic but with sweet undertone that probably had to do with Sangurix biology. It made his mouth tingle in ways that suggested it was doing something to his system, though the medical staff had assured him it was safe for humans in small quantities. When Saris accepted his blood in return, her eyes shifted from silver to crimson briefly. Response to the taste, probably, or to the biological recognition that they were now formally bonded. She held his gaze steadily, and for the first time since this entire situation began, Ethan saw something that looked like genuine acceptance in her expression rather than resigned determination. The ceremony concluded with formal declarations, witnessed by the Queen and the assembled court. They were bonded. Ethan was now officially Saris's mate according to Sangurix law, which meant he had rights and responsibilities within their society that few humans ever achieved. Saris was now bonded to human, which meant she'd made history while simultaneously complicating her own life considerably. After the ceremony, there was reception that felt more like military review than celebration. Various Sangurix nobles approached to offer formal congratulations that were mostly thinly veiled curiosity about how this unprecedented bond would function. Ethan smiled and was polite and tried not to say anything that would cause diplomatic incident. Sarah stood beside him, her presence protective in ways that made it clear anyone who insulted her newly bonded mate would face her personal displeasure. One particularly bold noble, young male with the arrogant bearing of someone who'd never faced real challenge, approached and addressed Saris directly while ignoring Ethan completely. "Commander Valen, I must say I am surprised you chose to honor the resonance with the human. Many of us expected you would choose the dignity of separation rather than the compromise of bonding with lesser species." The temperature in the immediate area seemed to drop. Saris's eyes shifted to crimson, and her voice dropped to lethal quiet. "My mate is human, not lesser, and you will address him with respect or you will find yourself explaining to the Queen why you insulted formal bonding witnessed by the entire court." The noble blanched and quickly made apology, to both of them this time, before retreating. Several other Sangurics who'd been watching nodded approval. Apparently standing up for your mate was valued trait, and Saris had just demonstrated she would tolerate no disrespect toward Ethan regardless of his species. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly once they had moment of privacy. "You are my mate now," Saris replied simply. "Protecting you from insult is not favor, it is obligation I am pleased to fulfill." That night they returned to Saris's quarters, now their shared quarters, which was adjustment they'd have to navigate. The bond was complete. They were formally united, and now they had to figure out how to actually live together. "So," Ethan said, standing awkwardly in space that was still more hers than theirs, "what happens now?" "Now we sleep," Saris said practically. "It has been a long day. Tomorrow we return to our duties, you to your research, me to my service to the Queen. And we learn how to be partners alongside those responsibilities. That's it, no dramatic bonding night, no intense emotional reckoning. We have been doing emotional reckoning for 7 days. I am exhausted from feelings, Dr. Cole. I would prefer to rest." But she smiled slightly. "Though I acknowledge your human expectations may include more romance than I am currently equipped to provide." "Rest is fine," Ethan agreed. "Romance can wait until we actually like each other. We are bonded for life, we have time to develop fondness." Saris moved toward the sleeping area, then paused. "Ethan, thank you for accepting this bond. I know it was not your choice any more than it was mine, but I am glad it was you who triggered resonance. You are adequate partner, possibly even good partner, we will discover which." Coming from Saris, that was practically declaration of love. Ethan smiled. "You're adequate too, possibly even good, we'll figure it out together." Over the following weeks, they settled into routine that was strange but functional. Saris continued her duties as Queen's bodyguard, though now with accommodations for having human mate who needed to know her schedule and who worried when she left for dangerous assignments. Ethan continued his research, though now with greater access to Sanguric's biological and cultural information, because he was family by bonding rather than guest by diplomacy. They learned each other's rhythms, preferences, irritations. Saris learned that Ethan needed morning quiet to think properly, that he got absorbed in research and forgot to eat, and that he had surprising talent for tactical analysis despite having no combat training. Ethan learned that Saris needed physical activity to manage stress, that she actually had sharp sense of humor she rarely displayed publicly, and that beneath the deadly warrior exterior, she was surprisingly thoughtful about philosophical questions. They argued about schedule conflicts, about cultural misunderstandings, about Ethan's tendency to wander into restricted areas following research interests. But they also laughed, shared meals, and gradually built partnership that was based on genuine respect rather than just biological imperative. 3 months after the bonding, Ethan returned to their quarters after a long day of research to find Saris sitting in contemplative silence, which usually meant something significant had happened. "Problem?" he asked. "Observation," she corrected. "I was thinking about the night you accidentally triggered the resonance. I was furious. I thought you had ruined my life through your human clumsiness. I wanted to reject the entire situation." "And now?" Ethan prompted carefully. "Now I think perhaps my biology was wiser than my conscious mind. You are good partner, Ethan. Better than I expected. Better than I thought possible given our species differences." The resonance was not mistake. It was recognition of compatibility that I was too prejudiced to see. Ethan sat beside her. "So you're saying you're glad I accidentally groped you during sacred ceremony?" Saris made sound that might have been laugh. "I am saying I am grateful the resonance forced me to see past my preconceptions. I am saying that the bond I resisted has become something I value. I am saying that you are adequate mate who I have discovered I actually like, not just tolerate. Adequate and liked. That's basically Sanguric's for I love you, right? Do not become arrogant human. I said liked, not loved." Love requires more time. How much more time? Ask me again in 50 years. Perhaps by then I will have developed genuine affection. But she was smiling, and her eyes were silver rather than crimson, which meant she was content. Ethan smiled back. I can wait 50 years, we've got time. And they did. Decades of partnership ahead, built on foundation of accidental resonance that became genuine choice, proving that sometimes the bonds that shouldn't exist are the ones that matter most. The clumsy human who bumped into the deadly vampire warrior's backside during sacred ceremony had become her mate, her partner, her equal in ways neither of them expected. And the warrior who'd wanted to kill him for triggering impossible bond had become his fiercest protector and closest companion. It was unprecedented, it was strange, and it was working, which was all that mattered. 5 years after the bonding, Ethan and Saris had achieved something neither expected. They'd become normal. Not normal by broader galactic standards. They were still the only formally bonded interspecies pair in Sanguric's history, still subject to curiosity and occasional hostility from traditionalists, but normal in the sense that their partnership had become routine, comfortable, and genuinely functional in ways that transcended the biological imperative that had started it. Ethan's research had expanded significantly. His bonding with Saris gave him unprecedented access to Sanguric's biological and cultural information, and his work studying their unique physiology had produced several groundbreaking papers that advanced xenobiology as a field. He'd become recognized expert on Sanguric's human relations, which was both flattering and occasionally exhausting when he was called to consult on diplomatic situations between their species. Saris remained Queen Valeria's personal bodyguard, though her duties had shifted slightly to accommodate her bonded status. She still accompanied the Queen to formal events and defended her from threats, but she now also served as informal bridge between Sanguric's court and humanity's diplomatic representatives. Turns out being bonded to human researcher made her uniquely positioned to explain human behavior to confused Sanguric's nobles and vice versa. Their partnership had developed from awkward coexistence to genuine affection. They still argued about Ethan's tendency to hyperfocus on research and miss important social events, about Saris's overprotective instincts that sometimes made Ethan feel smothered, about fundamental cultural differences that occasionally caused misunderstandings. But they'd also learned how to navigate those conflicts, how to communicate effectively across species differences, and how to find compromise that served them both. Tonight was anniversary of sorts. 5 years since the disastrous eclipse ceremony where Ethan had accidentally triggered the resonance. They decided to mark the occasion privately rather than making it public event, which suited both their preferences for avoiding excessive attention. Ethan had arranged surprise, not easy when your mate had centuries of experience reading people and enhanced senses that made hiding things nearly impossible. But he'd managed, with help from several Sangurics who'd become genuine friends over the past 5 years, and who apparently enjoyed helping him be romantic despite their species' general lack of enthusiasm for human-style emotional displays. He transformed their shared quarters into something approximating human romantic dinner setting. Lighting, adjusted to levels comfortable for both species. Food that incorporated both Sangurics and human preferences, and privacy shields activated so they wouldn't be interrupted by the constant demands of their respective duties. When Saris returned from her day's assignments, she stopped in the doorway, her expression cycling through confusion, surprise, and something that might have been pleased. "What is this?" she asked. "Anniversary celebration," Ethan explained. 5 years since I accidentally bumped into you and changed both our lives. I thought we should acknowledge that. You created elaborate meal and romantic atmosphere to celebrate the day I threatened to kill you. I created elaborate meal and romantic atmosphere to celebrate the day we started becoming partners. The death threats were just the opening act. Saris moved into the room, studying the arrangements with attention that made Ethan slightly nervous. Sanguriks didn't typically do romantic gestures the way humans did, and he wasn't entirely sure if this would be received as thoughtful or as strange human behavior she'd have to politely tolerate. "This is unexpected," Sarah said finally. "I did not think you would want to celebrate what was objectively traumatic experience for both of us." "It was traumatic," Ethan agreed, "but it led here, to this partnership that I actually value, despite all the complications. That seems worth acknowledging." Sarah sat across from him, and her eyes had shifted to the warm silver that indicated genuine contentment. "You are strange human, Ethan Cole, but I have become accustomed to your strangeness, and I appreciate this gesture." They ate, sharing conversation that had become easy over 5 years of practice. Ethan told her about his latest research findings, breakthrough in understanding how Sangurik's biology could potentially be adapted to help human colonists survive on worlds with harsh conditions. Saris told him about the political maneuvering in court, about challenges she was managing in her role, about the young Sangurik's warrior she was mentoring who reminded her of herself at that age. Partway through the meal, Saris set down her utensils and looked at him directly. "I need to tell you something. I have been considering it for several months, trying to determine how to articulate it properly." Ethan felt slight nervous flutter. "That sounds ominous." "It is not ominous. It is merely difficult for me to express." Saris paused, clearly choosing words carefully. "When I first bonded with you, I did so out of obligation. The resonance made rejection too costly, so I accepted the bond while believing I would learn to tolerate you at best. I expected our partnership to be functional but emotionally distant. I expected to fulfill my duties as mate while maintaining internal separation." "And," Ethan prompted when she fell silent, "and I was wrong. You are not merely adequate mate I learned to tolerate. You have become essential to my life in ways I did not anticipate. You challenge me, support me, make me consider perspectives I would otherwise miss. You have somehow made the centuries I have spent in military service feel less isolating." She met his eyes directly. "I love you, Ethan. I resisted admitting that even to myself because it felt like weakness. But it is not weakness. It is strength I did not know I was missing." Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion he didn't have words for. "You said to ask you again in 50 years whether you developed genuine affection. It's only been 5 years. You're ahead of schedule." "I am efficient. It is one of my better qualities." But Saris was smiling, and her hand reached across the table to take his. "You asked me once why I chose to accept the bond rather than reject it. I told you I was curious about whether partnership could work. Now I can say with certainty, it works. You work. We work. And I am grateful my biology recognized that before my conscious mind was ready to accept it." "I love you too," Ethan said. "I've loved you for probably 3 years, but I was waiting for you to get there first because I didn't want to pressure you with human emotional expectations." 3 years? Saris looked surprised. "Why did you not say anything?" "Because you needed time to figure out your own feelings without me adding pressure. And because I knew if I said it before you were ready, you'd retreat into formal politeness, and we'd lose the genuine connection we were building." "That is remarkably perceptive, and probably accurate. You understand me better than I sometimes understand myself." Sarah stood, moving around the table to pull him into embrace that was still careful. She was always conscious of her strength compared to his human fragility, but also genuinely affectionate. They stayed like that for a long moment, and Ethan felt the rightness of it. Partnership built on accidental biology but maintained through genuine choice and effort, proving that sometimes the most important relationships start with disaster and become something worth celebrating. Later that night, after they'd finished the meal and Ethan had revealed the dessert he'd somehow convinced Sangurik's chefs to prepare that incorporated both their species' preferences, they sat together looking out at Noctera's night sky. "Do you have regrets?" Ethan asked. about how we started, about being bonded to human instead of Sangurik's partner you could have chosen under normal circumstances. Saris was quiet for a moment. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been without you. Whether I would have eventually found resonance with Sangurik's warrior, or whether I would have remained unbonded, focused solely on my service to the Queen. But I do not regret what actually occurred. This partnership with you specifically has made me better warrior, better advisor, better person. I am more complete with you than I was alone. But even though I'm clumsy human who accidentally groped you during sacred ceremony. Especially because you are clumsy human who accidentally triggered impossible bond, and then had courage to make it work despite neither of us knowing what we were doing. Saris pulled him closer. We made history, Ethan. First interspecies bonded pair in Sanguric civilization. That will be remembered long after we are both gone. But I'd rather be remembered as happy together than just historically significant. We can be both. I am skilled at achieving multiple objectives simultaneously. They fell into comfortable silence, the kind that 5 years of partnership had made natural. Outside, Noctera's eternal night continued, and somewhere in the citadel, the Queen's court conducted its business, and two civilizations continued building alliance that had been strengthened by one impossible bond between human and vampire. The accidental bump that started everything had become foundation for something neither species expected. The death threat that followed had become beginning of genuine love. And the two beings who should never have been compatible had become proof that sometimes biology knows things consciousness takes years to accept. Ethan had come to Noctera, expecting to study Sangurix and return to human space after his research term concluded. Instead, he'd accidentally triggered mate bond with deadly vampire warrior, survived the political fallout, chosen to honor the bond, and built partnership that was both personally fulfilling and historically significant. It was the best accident of his life. And judging by the way Saris held him, protective but gentle, fierce but loving, she agreed. They'd started with disaster and ended with love. Which was, Ethan thought, probably the best possible outcome for clumsy human who bumped into alien vampire woman's backside and somehow didn't die in the immediately following moments. Resonance. You are adequate partner. Possibly even good partner. We will discover which. Coming from Saris, that was practically declaration of love. Ethan smiled. You're adequate too, possibly even good. We'll figure it out together. But over the following weeks, they settled into routine that was strange but functional. Saris continued her duties as Queen's bodyguard, though now with accommodations for having human mate who needed to know her schedule and who worried when she left for dangerous assignments. Ethan continued his research, though now with greater access to Sanguric's biological and cultural information, because he was family by bonding rather than guest by diplomacy. They learned each other's rhythms, preferences, irritations. Saris learned that Ethan needed morning quiet to think properly, that he got absorbed in research and forgot to eat, and that he had surprising talent for tactical analysis despite having no combat training. Ethan learned that Saris needed physical activity to manage stress, that she actually had sharp sense of humor she rarely displayed publicly, and that beneath the deadly warrior exterior, she was surprisingly thoughtful about philosophical questions. They argued about schedule conflicts, about cultural misunderstandings, about Ethan's tendency to wander into restricted areas following research interests. But they also laughed, shared meals, and gradually built partnership that was based on genuine respect rather than just biological imperative. 3 months after the bonding, Ethan returned to their quarters after a long day of research to find Saris sitting in contemplative silence, which usually meant something significant had happened. Problem? He asked. Observation, she corrected. I was thinking about the night you accidentally triggered the resonance. I was furious. I thought you had ruined my life through your human clumsiness. I wanted to reject the entire situation. And now, Ethan prompted carefully. Now I think perhaps my biology was wiser than my conscious mind. You are good partner, Ethan. Better than I expected. Better than I thought possible given our species' differences. The resonance was not mistake. It was recognition of compatibility that I was too prejudiced to see. Ethan sat beside her. So you're saying you're glad I accidentally groped you during sacred ceremony? Saris made sound that might have been laugh. I am saying I am grateful the resonance forced me to see past my preconceptions. I am saying that the bond I resisted has become something I value. I am saying that you are adequate mate who I have discovered I actually like, not just tolerate. Adequate and liked. That's basically Sangurix for I love you, right? Do not become arrogant human. I said liked, not loved. Love requires more time. How much more time? Ask me again in 50 years. Perhaps by then I will have developed genuine affection. But she was smiling, and her eyes were silver rather than crimson, which meant she was content. Ethan smiled back. I can wait 50 years, we've got time. And they did. Decades of partnership ahead, built on foundation of accidental resonance that became genuine choice, proving that sometimes the bonds that shouldn't exist are the ones that matter most. The clumsy human who bumped into the deadly vampire warrior's backside during sacred ceremony had become her mate, her partner, her equal in ways neither of them expected. And the warrior who'd wanted to kill him for triggering impossible bond had become his fiercest protector and closest companion. It was unprecedented, it was strange, and it was working, which was all that mattered. 5 years after the bonding, Ethan and Saris had achieved something neither expected. They'd become normal. Not normal by broader galactic standards. They were still the only formally bonded interspecies pair in Sangurix history, still subject to curiosity and occasional hostility from traditionalists. But normal in the sense that their partnership had become routine, comfortable, and genuinely functional in ways that transcended the biological imperative that had started it. Ethan's research had expanded significantly. His bonding with Saris gave him unprecedented access to Sangurix biological and cultural information, and his work studying their unique physiology had produced several groundbreaking papers that advanced xenobiology as a field. He'd become recognized expert on Sangurix-human relations, which was both flattering and occasionally exhausting when he was called to consult on diplomatic situations between their species. Saris remained Queen Valeria's personal bodyguard, though her duties had shifted slightly to accommodate her bonded status. She still accompanied the Queen to formal events and defended her from threats, but she now also served as informal bridge between Sangurix court and humanity's diplomatic representatives. Turns out being bonded to human researcher made her uniquely positioned to explain human behavior to confused Sangurix nobles and vice versa. Their partnership had developed from awkward coexistence to genuine affection. They still argued about Ethan's tendency to hyperfocus on research and miss important social events, about Saris's overprotective instincts that sometimes made Ethan feel smothered, about fundamental cultural differences that occasionally caused misunderstandings. But they'd also learned how to navigate those conflicts, how to communicate effectively across species differences, and how to find compromise that served them both. Tonight was anniversary of sorts, 5 years since the disastrous eclipse ceremony where Ethan had accidentally triggered the resonance. They decided to mark the occasion privately rather than making it public event, which suited both their preferences for avoiding excessive attention. Ethan had arranged surprise. Not easy when your mate had centuries of experience reading people and enhanced senses that made hiding things nearly impossible. But he'd managed, with help from several Sangurix who'd become genuine friends over the past 5 years, and who apparently enjoyed helping him be romantic despite their species' general lack of enthusiasm for human-style emotional displays. He transformed their shared quarters into something approximating human romantic dinner setting. Lighting, adjusted to levels comfortable for both species. food that incorporated both Sangurics and human preferences, and privacy shields activated so they wouldn't be interrupted by the constant demands of their respective duties. When Saris returned from her day's assignments, she stopped in the doorway, her expression cycling through confusion, surprise, and something that might have been pleased. "What is this?" she asked. "Anniversary celebration," Ethan explained. "5 years since I accidentally bumped into you and changed both our lives. I thought we should acknowledge that. You created elaborate meal and romantic atmosphere to celebrate the day I threatened to kill you." I created elaborate meal and romantic atmosphere to celebrate the day we started becoming partners. The death threats were just the opening act. Saris moved into the room, studying the arrangements with attention that made Ethan slightly nervous. Sangurics didn't typically do romantic gestures the way humans did, and he wasn't entirely sure if this would be received as thoughtful or as strange human behavior she'd have to politely tolerate. "This is unexpected," Saris said finally. "I did not think you would want to celebrate what was objectively traumatic experience for both of us." "It was traumatic," Ethan agreed, "but it led here, to this partnership that I actually value, despite all the complications. That seems worth acknowledging." Saris sat across from him, and her eyes had shifted to the warm silver that indicated genuine contentment. "You are strange human, Ethan Cole, but I have become accustomed to your strangeness, and I appreciate this gesture." They ate, sharing conversation that had become easy over 5 years of practice. Ethan told her about his latest research findings, breakthrough in understanding how Sangurics biology could potentially be adapted to help human colonists survive on worlds with harsh conditions. Saris told him about the political maneuvering in court, about challenges she was managing in her role, about the young Sangurics warrior she was mentoring who reminded her of herself at that age. Partway through the meal, Saris set down her utensils and looked at him directly. "I need to tell you something. I have been considering it for several months, trying to determine how to articulate it properly." Ethan felt slight nervous flutter. "That sounds ominous." "It is not ominous. It is merely difficult for me to express." Saris paused, clearly choosing words carefully. "When I first bonded with you, I did so out of obligation. The resonance made rejection too costly, so I accepted the bond while believing I would learn to tolerate you at best. I expected our partnership to be functional but emotionally distant. I expected to fulfill my duties as mate while maintaining internal separation." "And," Ethan prompted when she fell silent, "and I was wrong. You are not merely adequate mate I learned to tolerate. You have become essential to my life in ways I did not anticipate. You challenge me, support me, make me consider perspectives I would otherwise miss. You have somehow made the centuries I have spent in military service feel less isolating." She met his eyes directly. "I love you, Ethan. I resisted admitting that even to myself because it felt like weakness. But it is not weakness. It is strength I did not know I was missing." Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion he didn't have words for. "You said to ask you again in 50 years whether you developed genuine affection. It's only been 5 years. You're ahead of schedule." "I am efficient. It is one of my better qualities." But Saris was smiling, and her hand reached across the table to take his. "You asked me once why I chose to accept the bond rather than reject it. I told you I was curious about whether partnership could work. Now I can say with certainty, it works. You work. We work. And I am grateful my biology recognized